Welcome to the Fast Times News, where we bring you the stories that matter most. Subscribe now to stay informed on the biggest headlines shaking the world. But for those of you who want to go beyond the headlines, stick around for the deep dive, where we unpack the complexities behind the news. Today, we're diving into a series of threats that have targeted some of President-elect Donald Trump's cabinet picks. We've got reports from Reuters, AP, and CNN all covering this breaking news. What's really going on here?
Well, it's not just about random threats. The timing and the target suggest something more calculated, an attempt to disrupt the transition of power, and maybe even intimidate those joining Trump's administration.
Okay, so we're talking bomb threats, swatting incidents, basically false reports designed to trigger a massive police response. This is serious stuff happening right before Trump takes office.
Absolutely, and swatting itself is incredibly dangerous. Imagine someone calling in a fake hostage situation at your address. Suddenly, you've got a SWAT team bursting through your door, weapons drawn. The potential for tragic mistakes is huge.
The reports mention several high-profile targets. Elise Stefanik, Trump's pick for UN ambassador, even had a bomb threat called in on her family home. I can't even imagine the fear that would evoke.
And it gets worse. The reports say Stefanik had her young son with her when she got the news. Lee Zeldin, nominated to lead the EPA, also received a threat, this one with a pro-Palestinian message. This raises an important question. Are these attacks coming from a single source or multiple actors with different motives?
That's a chilling thought. And if you're finding this deep dive insightful so far, make sure to share it with your friends and family. Don't forget to subscribe to the Fast Times News for more in-depth analysis like this. This isn't just about politics, it's about people's lives being turned upside down. Imagine getting that call, a bomb threat, while driving with your 3-year-old.
Exactly. Beyond the immediate security concerns, these actions could have a chilling effect on the future of government service. Will qualified people be hesitant to serve if they fear for their safety and the safety of their families? This could have serious long-term consequences.
And it's not like this is a brand new tactic. Haven't we seen swatting incidents targeting judges and prosecutors involved in cases against Trump before?
Absolutely. These new threats against his cabinet nominees feel like an escalation of that same hostile climate.
So where do we go from here? What's being done to address these threats? The reports mention the FBI is involved, right?
Yes, the FBI is investigating, but so far, no suspects have been publicly identified. These investigations are complex. It often requires tracing digital trails and coordinating with multiple agencies. It'll be interesting to see if any clear motives or connections emerge.
Speaking of connections, CNN is also reporting on something that seems related. Trump's transition ethics plan. Apparently, it doesn't address potential conflicts of interest for Trump himself. His businesses, and even some new ventures like cryptocurrency, could pose issues. It makes you wonder if these threats are somehow connected to these potential conflicts.
That's a good question, and this isn't entirely surprising. Remember, Trump faced criticism for potential conflicts of interest throughout his first term. It seems those concerns are resurfacing already. This raises another important question. Could these concerns about Trump's ethics be motivating some of these attacks? Or are they completely unrelated? It's too early to say for sure. It's certainly a tangled web, and it'll be interesting to see how those potential conflicts of interest play out. But going back to the threats themselves, one thing that struck me was the variety of positions targeted.
You're right. It wasn't just one particular area of policy or ideology. We're seeing threats against nominees for UN ambassador, the EPA, housing and urban development,
Yeah.
agriculture, even the Labor Department.
Exactly. That diversity of targets suggests that this might not be about specific policy disagreements, but rather a broader attempt to sow chaos and disrupt the incoming administration as a whole. It's almost as if someone is trying to send a message. No one is safe.
Which leads to another question. Who is behind these attacks? Are the motives purely political? Or is there something more personal, even psychological, at play? It's disturbing to think that someone would resort to such tactics just to make a political point.
It is disturbing. And while we can speculate about motives, ultimately that's a question for investigators to answer. But one thing we can say for sure is that these threats have very real consequences. They create fear, disrupt the transition process, and potentially discourage qualified individuals from serving in government. It's like an attack on the very foundation of our political system.
That's a scary thought. What happens to our democracy if serving in government becomes a life-or-death proposition? Who will be left to run the country if qualified people are too afraid to step up?
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to take these threats seriously. We need to send a clear message that violence and intimidation have no place in our political discourse. This isn't about whether you agree with Trump's policies or not. It's about upholding the basic principles of a functioning democracy.
And for those of you just joining us, we are deep diving into the recent threats against Trump's cabinet picks right here on The Deep Dive, brought to you by the Fast Times News. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay on top of this story and others as they develop. But it's also important to remember that these threats are just one symptom of a larger problem. We're living in an increasingly polarized and divided society where political differences are often seen as personal attacks. And that can create a breeding ground for this kind of extremism.
That's a crucial point. These incidents are not isolated. They reflect a broader trend of escalating political violence and intimidation that we've been witnessing for years. And it's not just limited to the United States. We're seeing similar trends in other democracies around the world.
So is this the new normal? Have we reached a point where political violence and intimidation are just accepted parts of the process?
I certainly hope not. But the rise of social media and the spread of misinformation have undoubtedly contributed to a climate of distrust and hostility. It's easier than ever for extremist views to take root and spread, and that makes it harder to have constructive dialogue and find common ground.
And that brings us back to CNN's reporting on Trump's transition ethics plan. They're highlighting potential conflicts of interest stemming from his businesses and new ventures. It seems the same concerns that plagued his first term are already resurfacing.
The fact that these concerns are emerging so early in the transition process is definitely noteworthy. It suggests that Trump may not be taking these ethical considerations as seriously as he should be, which could further fuel the distrust and animosity we're seeing.
It raises questions about his commitment to transparency and accountability. And it's particularly concerning given the history of potential conflicts of interest during his first term. All of this is happening against the backdrop of an already volatile political climate. We've seen an increase in political violence, a rise in extremist rhetoric, and a growing distrust in institutions. It's almost like we're reaching a tipping point.
You're right. It's like all these factors are feeding into each other, creating a perfect storm of political instability. And that makes it even more important to stay informed, engage in civil discourse, and hold our leaders accountable for their actions. We can't afford to be complacent.
And that's why we encourage you to stay engaged, stay informed, and stay connected with the Fast Times News and The Deep Dive. We'll continue to bring you the latest developments and insights as this story unfolds. It's a lot to process. We've got these escalating threats, a deeply divided political landscape, and lingering questions about Trump's commitment to ethical leadership. So where does this leave us? What are the potential long-term implications of all of this?
It's hard to say for sure, but I think we're at a critical juncture. The decisions we make now, as individuals and as a society, they will have a profound impact on the future of our democracy. We can either choose to succumb to fear and division, or we can choose to stand up for our values and work towards a more civil and constructive political discourse.
And while we've covered a lot of ground here, it's important to remember that the investigations into these threats are still ongoing. We still don't know for sure who's behind them, what their motives are, or what the full extent of the danger might be. It's a developing story, and there's still a lot we don't know. But it's a story we need to pay attention to.
Absolutely. As more information comes to light, it'll be crucial to watch how law enforcement responds, how the political landscape is affected, and what steps, if any, are taken to address the root causes of this disturbing trend.
And for those of you listening, we encourage you to stay engaged and stay informed. Don't let fear and apathy paralyze you. Read the full reports, ask questions, and have those difficult conversations with your friends and family. And of course, stay connected with the Fast Times News and The Deep Dive for ongoing coverage and analysis. We'll be here to help you make sense of it all.
Because ultimately, the future of our democracy depends on an informed and engaged citizenry.
This deep dive has only scratched the surface, but hopefully it's given you a better understanding of the complexities at play. If you found this analysis helpful, be sure to share this episode with others. And hit that subscribe button for more deep dives from the Fast Times News.
Thanks for listening.